could make it. Today is the first class of the 2019 California Master Beekeeper Program San Diego edition. So for those of you that are here for that, welcome. The second half of this is a collaboration with the university and the County of San Diego Department of Agriculture Weights and Measures to provide more education and outreach on beekeeping laws, regulations, and we live in a unique county that has a lot of different regulations depending on what city you're in or what incorporated area you're in. So we wanted to provide this class to really answer all of your questions and connect beekeepers with city officials, with county officials, and we're so happy to have you all. So we have an agenda on the board. We have an agenda in your packet. There are restrooms out the door to your right on the top of the stairs. There are backup restrooms downstairs around the corner from the stairs you came up or the elevator. And please help yourself to refreshments. We'll have lunch around 11:30. And with that, I think I'd like to introduce my first speaker is Dr. Tracy Ellis. She's the county entomologist, agricultural scientist for the Department of Ag Weights and Measures. She's been there for over 10 years now, and she is our resident beekeeping regulatory guru. So thank you, Tracy, and thank you.
So I know we have beekeepers here, lots of beekeepers, but we also have people from cities in the county, and I wanted to see who.
Is that too dark? Sorry, I'm sorry, Tracy. Is this too dark for everyone? We could open the window.
No.
Or we could do one.
No.
I lost my first slide though. Oh, here it is. So,
Better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Will you turn it back on?
Oh, no. We're sorry, technical difficulties.
Maybe in the back.
One on?
who is from cities, city officials, local cities in the county? And why, could you introduce yourselves?
I'm Alice Shepherd. I work with code enforcement with the city of San Diego, downtown office.
Welcome.
And I'm Lisa Poston. I'm also Development Services Code Enforcement in the City of San Diego.
Thank you for coming today. Are there any other city officials here?
I'm city treasurer, National City, but I'm a beekeeper.
Okay. Cross both paths. Excellent. Well, we are going to cover a lot of detail today, and I have handouts in your packets that we will be able to, you can refer to them later if you have specifics, because we're going to, when you talk about regulations, you know that there's more detail than you could ever kind of cover in a presentation for bees. And I'm going to speak to some of this might be redundant for beekeepers, but because we have city officials. Oh, are you a city official?
I'm not actually directly, but I'm working with the city of Oceanside.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to take this information and pass it on to them.
So
I'm
nobody,
Simon, by the way.
hi Simon.
Thank you,
So
Tracy.
nobody
one?
showed up from Oceanside.
Oh,
Okay. We will probably be giving this talk to other cities or have another type of discussion like this, more directed. We put this together a little late to get out the word to everybody, so we're going to try to do this again this spring. So today I'm going to discuss examples in apiary laws and regulations from the whole nation, and to try to give our regulatory officials and yourselves a sort of an overview, national and statewide. And what you're going to see is that depending on the location of where the bees are located and what the industry is and how important the apicultural industry is. By the way, apiculture is agriculture bees. So just think of that. Api is bee, honey, and culture, apiculture. So I'll be referring, there's certain words. Apiary refers to a place where you keep honeybees. We're going to try to get you a framework for that. And so depending on where you're located, the states have different priorities. The towns have different priorities. They're either emphasizing honeybee health, if it's a place like Mississippi, which we'll discuss some of their apiary laws, their whole priority is honeybee health, and they regulate that to the nines. It's a rural area. It only has maybe 1/5 of the population of San Diego County in the whole state, so they're not concerned about public safety, say, as much as some other places do. So apiary regulations either emphasize health of the honeybee or public safety or some combination of both. And I'm going to kind of bring you through the typical what apiary regulations are like across the board, the main points, but by no means is it, something that you can just understand in one session. Then Jaime's going to discuss our local unincorporated county bee ordinance, and then Leah is going to discuss the municipalities within San Diego County. So I'm going to talk a little bit about honeybees and insects and what might make it important to regulate them. And really, the end all to what I'm trying to accomplish is what you might want to consider in making future laws and regulations. So I'm going to try to cover terminology, so when you pick up a regulation, you might be able, you'll get a good understanding of what sorts of things are concerning. And really this is all towards your involvement as beekeepers and as city officials in trying to get going forward and making regulations that really meet your needs. And so I think I covered this. So normally the whole reason behind honeybee laws and regulations was really about protecting the economic contributions of honeybees and beekeepers. Honey and pollination, as you know, is a big industry, pollination. And the reason why most laws got on the books was because of foul brood and other contagious diseases. So for people that aren't used to the idea, I'm going to cover a little bit about diseases and insects. But basically, the whole motive was because beekeepers wanted to control and use laws and regulations to try to contain diseases and pests that might negatively impact the economic viability of the industry. And that's generally true for most regulations. The other thing that is included in a lot of beekeeping regulations is the protection of bees from pesticide applications. So obviously the beekeepers recognize they're in an intensive agricultural situation and they want to know when the insecticides or anything that might affect bees is going to impact their operations. So part of what regulations do is notify beekeepers about when sprays are occurring. And the other, as I discussed before, the other emphasis that regulations have is on public safety. Stinging incidents, we all know, is a bad thing. It's bad for the reputation of beekeepers when stinging incidents occur. And they don't want a panic or public panic or any public bad publicity that makes bees look bad in front of people. And of course, there is sort of an offshoot that our county agriculture department does do in the state of California and the USDA is to protect the authenticity of honey, to make sure that honey is safe to eat and it has a origin that's specified and real and true, and that there's no contaminants in honey. So those are the basic apiary laws and regulations. And the roles of the apiary inspector, Jaime, and other inspectors around the country are detecting contagious pests or diseases when they inspect a hive to make sure that anything that's in there might not present a threat to agriculture, and to try to contain it. And so we put a little caution. We didn't have our quarantine tape here, but we did put a little mock-up of what might happen if there was contagion or some disease in your colonies. The other thing that in California a lot of bee inspectors do is do third-party assessment. In other words, they're protecting the grower from beekeepers that are supplying bees, and making sure that beekeepers are doing their due diligence to provide the bees for honey pollination, So they come and they make sure, I'm trying to give this, so when bees come into California and they are shipped in to pollinate almonds, the almond producer hires a beekeeper, and they hire the beekeeper to bring almonds into their orchard. And the colony that they bring is supposed to be a certain strength in order to pollinate and do the work that they're supposed to do. And they're paying a pretty penny for that pollination service. So sometimes in the Central Valley, the beekeepers are sort of a third party to make sure, and there's independent contractors more or less, because the counties can't keep up with the need to provide this strength evaluation to make sure that the almond pollinators, almond growers are not being in any way mistook or misled by beekeepers. And the other is that if the regulations emphasize zoning or code enforcement, the apiary inspector becomes a lot like a zoning or code enforcement officer. In our ordinance, we have distance requirements. So Jaime's multifaceted. Jaime does both colony health inspection as well as sort of a typical code enforcement type evaluation, where he's measuring distances and distances from the next house, and distances from the property line, and distance from a sensitive site, and kind of taking the whole picture as to whether this is good for safe for public safety in terms of distances. And also, we play a big role between, the inspector plays a big mediator role between neighbors and beekeepers. And so when there's a snafu, someone's complaining about beekeepers, and we kind of try to get in there, and maybe Simon can discuss that. We kind of get in there, and you can ask Simon about his situation in Oceanside later. But, to help and try to work with both parties to try to settle whatever is going on. So in the big scheme of things, in regulation for bees is the USDA, which is our federal agency. USDA and EPA are involved. The EPA is involved because all pesticide labels have to be labeled as to whether the pesticide has special regulations related to bees, and EPA regulates and makes labels on pesticides. So they decide whether this needs a special warning, any special conditions, and whatnot. So that's your federal agency taking care of things, okay, in agriculture. Beneath that, for us in California, it would be CDFA. California Department of Agriculture, the Cal EPA, which also puts special regulations on pesticides that might be harmful to bees, as well as the Department of Pesticide Regulation. And so the Department of Pesticide Regulation is very involved in the Central Valley, trying to reach out to beekeepers and almond growers to make sure that those two things do not conflict, to provide a safe place where people don't have hive die-offs and hive spraying and things like that. And yes?
So let me get this straight. If I go into Home Depot and buy a bottle of insecticide for my garden, will it indicate on there whether it's bee safe or not?
Okay, now very good question. So
What was the question?
the question was, if she goes to Home Depot and buys an insecticide, will it indicate whether it's harmful to bees or not? And yes, it will. In a very general sense, will say product will be toxic to bees. So,
Okay.
however, this is another good thing to know about regulation with pesticides. There's like two worlds to insecticides. There's the commercial world that the growers are using the labels for pesticides that they use when you earn income from a crop. You are certified to spray, you take licenses, you have an applicator that has licenses to spray, and then you use insecticides based on the label for commercial agricultural production. For the homeowner, there's a whole nother batch of insecticides that are available to you with a different label. So in the commercial product area, there's a little bee label now, and it has a little bee on it, and it says this product is, bad for bees, and you must notify your local beekeepers if you spray this product. And that's where the Department of Pesticide Regulation gets in, is that, okay, so let me just finish the thought here. There's the federal, there's the state, and then there's us, the county agricultural commissioners. So Jaime and I and Bill and Alice and Warren are all like boots on the ground for the regulations that are set up by these upper agencies. So we're kind of where the rubber meets the road as far as enforcement goes. And what I was going to say was, when people register their beehives in the state of California, they report to the agricultural commissioners if there is one in their county. And when somebody is producing, let's say they're growing in San Diego, they're spraying avocados, and they pick up the jug and it has that little bee label on it with a little bee picture. They call us and ask us where the bees are located, or who are the beekeepers within the area that they're going to spray. And so we are the keepers of that information, so we tell them the contact information and the phone number of the beekeeper so that the beekeeper has the option of moving their bees they get 48-hour notice. And this happens all the time in the Central Valley, because as much as they stop trying to spray during the time that the pollination occurs, but then there's some fungicides and some things that go on towards the end of the pollination. And so it's really important to get the beekeepers notified so they can remove their bees out of the field. So that's where we fall. We don't do any regulation if a homeowner wants to spray something that's toxic to bees. Most of the pesticides labeled for homeowners say do not apply to flowering plants toxic to bees, or something like that. So, but there's nothing on there that says notify your local beekeeper. So, and this is a problem in a lot of homeowner products as well. And so as time goes on, there's fewer and fewer products available to homeowners because there is the propensity for misuse. And this is true in the vertebrate pest control area with poisonings and things like that of pets and things like that. So they've taken a lot of mouse things off the market because there's inadvertent secondary pests. So I hope that answers your question. So we're talking two different worlds here. We're talking the big grower and then we're talking the homeowner. Okay, the next one is that the Honeybee Act, the USDA, think of the USDA as your protection internationally. The USDA is pretty much only concerned with what comes in from other countries. They're the first sort of line of defense against contagious diseases, and they intend to allow import only of honeybees that are free from diseases or parasites, and only want to allow desirable species of honeybees. And they have had, that started in 1922, they pretty much put a clamp on importation of honeybees from any other country. And then they amended it a few times since then. And they really deal with, the federal law deals with what is coming in from other countries. So that's that. And you can go to the next slide. And then California, we discussed, deals with registration of insecticides. And you do have a copy of all of California state law in there. I took out the main things. Registration of apiaries is a state law, and it's reporting to whatever county commissioner you have your bees located in. So for people that are moving their bees from one county to the other, they have to register with each commissioner where they move their bees. And there are pretty solid quarantine regulations for especially foul brood disease colonies or equipment. Identification is required on the hive, and hive identification statewide is related to when your honeybees are on somebody else's land. If it's on your own land, you don't need to have that's state. The county ordinance, the unincorporated county ordinance, requires identification on your hive in the unincorporated areas of the county, and that is so we can contact you if there's a problem or a complaint. Inspector has right of entry. That's in California state law. Of course, the pesticide application notification we discussed is written in. The agricultural commissioner is the keeper of the registrants' names and phone numbers. That information is private. Right now in California, your beekeeper registration information is one of the most protected items I've ever seen in state law. I don't know whether it's going to change or not, but we only can give contact information to a pesticide applicator. We can't give the location of the hive. We can give it to you, we can give it to them so they can contact you, but it can't even be subpoenaed with a Public Information Act. It's one of those things. But as time goes on, people are realizing that this might not make sense, and they're talking about mapping out where the hives are. Other states allow public information of where the location of hives are. And I think California is probably moving in that direction. And we are going to watch a video about the border inspection stations of incoming hives. And you will see from the video that California is really strong on inspections at the border stations, but it's mostly for pests that are associated with hives. In other words, things that get on the hive because they're in Georgia or Florida, like red imported fire ant. If they're from Maine, they might have gypsy moth on them. They don't want to have any soil or soil pathogens on them. So they're checking for things that aren't necessarily related to honeybee health. And this might change in the future, but I think that they got a little overwhelmed at the border stations because there's so many honeybees coming in. So I just wanted to show you this video so that you can get an idea of how much goes on during the pollination season in California.
California almond industry requires 1.6 million hives of honeybees to pollinate 760,000 acres of almonds. Nearly 1.2 million of those colonies come from outside the state. That's over 2,600 truckloads of bees that enter California from all over the country. In that journey, each of those trucks must pass through a border inspection station to be certain that it's free of invasive pests that damage California's agriculture. This is done to protect $8 billion a year fruit, nut, seed, and fiber industry that thrives in California. Hi, I'm Gordon Wardell, Science Advisor to Project APIS M. Together with the California Department of Food and Agriculture, we're preparing a series of best management practice videos on how to prepare your bees for almond pollination. In this installment, we're going to discuss how to prepare your bees for transportation to California and what to expect when you reach the border inspection stations. Many beekeepers ask, when a truck arrives at a border inspection station, what are border inspectors looking for? Basically, anything that isn't a honeybee or from a honeybee colony, including many bee pests and a myriad of other hitchhikers. Anything found in a hive or on the deck of the truck that isn't a honeybee has to be identified. Insects unknown to the inspector or potentially serious pests will have to be photographed, and the image will be sent electronically to Sacramento for identification. This can cause delays of a few minutes to several hours. It may seem excessive, but this is an important step to help protect California's agriculture. This is why it's important to get the load as clean as possible before heading to California. The most common problems that delay trucks at the border are small hive beetle larvae, hive beetle adults, fire ants, other miscellaneous ants, and mud on the pallets, just to name a few. Loads can be rejected for weeds stuck between the colonies or pallets, and other serious pests such as cereal leaf beetle or gypsy moth egg masses can cause a load to be rejected as well. The CDFA participates in a voluntary ant certification program in cooperation with several other states. These certificates must be issued by the state apiarist in the last state where the colonies were placed on the ground. Cleaning, inspection, and certification of the colonies must take place no more than 7 days before the hives arrive in California. There are advantages to participating in the certification program. Certified shipments have a tolerance of up to 5 hitchhiking or rogue ants without being rejected at the border. Otherwise, this load would not be accepted into California. It would have to be sent out of state for remedial sanitation. Certified shipments will be allowed to offload at the designation without waiting for clearance from the county ag commissioner if no ants are found or other pests were found at the border inspection station. The certification must take place in the state of origin no more than 7 days before the colonies arrive. Certificate. Ant certification inspection can be done either on the ground or on a truck trailer. In either case, the colonies must be accessible to the inspector. For inspection on the ground, a solid surface, either plastic or concrete, must extend at least 10 feet beyond the beekeeping equipment to qualify for state certification. Once the colonies are loaded and before the screens are stapled down, it might be advisable to give the truck bed a quick wash with pressurized hose or a quick clean with a leaf blower. This will remove any debris or insects that were knocked loose during the loading process. Remember, Time spent checking the load before departing can only improve your chances of getting through the border inspection without a hitch. Mud on pallets, weeds between colonies, or hitchhiking insects can cause serious delays at the border. Remember, when selecting colonies to go to almond pollination, equipment should be clean and in good condition. Equipment with rot can harbor ants and other pests. Look carefully for anything out of the ordinary. Bagworm casings, insect egg masses, or hibernating insects hiding between the colonies or under the leaf cleats can cause problems. A leaf blower will do wonders to remove many of these insects and potential problems. Brush and remove all mud and plant matter from between the colonies and the pallets before leaving. Drivers should have the voluntary certification paperwork ready. Drivers must provide the exact physical address of the location where the colonies will be placed in California. P.O. boxes, range or township, or GPS coordinates are not acceptable. Plan to arrive at the border inspection station during the normal working hours, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. This is when pest IDs can be done more quickly in Sacramento. To avoid dehydration, consider pre-watering the load prior to arriving at the border inspection station. Most inspection stations are trying to make water available to drivers to wet their colonies if they're held up while waiting pest ID from Sacramento. For more information on the California Border Inspection Standards, CDFA contact information, the Voluntary Ant Certification Program, and other related issues, please go to the Project APSM website at www.projectapsm.org.
Question?
Where would these hives be coming from? What states?
All around the country.
All around the country?
A lot from Florida.
What is the question?
Where were these hives coming from? And they're coming from all around the country. A lot from Florida. And what this means for us is that when a bee truck crosses the state line, the person has a destination, and the border station will notify us, for example, when a truck is coming to San Diego County. They'll ask, where are you going? And they'll give them Jaime's number and say, check in with this guy when you get here. And so that will happen for any county, and you can imagine that like Kern County and those middle counties, Central Valley, are very inundated with, inspections. So what you saw there is that California does not require you to have a health certificate from another state when you import. What it has is voluntary compliance agreements with certain people, and they're expanding this program to, if you want to have your load pre-inspected at another state, and certain states are in collaboration with California, then, and you pass the border station and you have a certificate from that state, you'll get an easier time of it coming across. So what they're trying to do is have as many other states engage in pre-clearing and pre-inspecting the honeybees before they get here. And what helps is that states like Florida and Mississippi all require certification when they come back home. So they won't let them back into Florida unless they're already, they have to be inspected, and then they need a certification when they go out. So there's certifications differ in the requirements differ no matter what state you're in. But by having this certification, there's opportunities for the hives to be inspected at certain locations. It's just too much having 1.4 million hives coming into California to inspect them. So California is counting on other states to make sure that they have their honeybees inspected when they get here. Okay, now what I wanted to talk about is that I just wanted to make sure that you know where San Diego County fits in to the regulations of counties that are similar to San Diego County. In other words, Southern California counties, and how our regulations are different compared to a lot of the counties in Southern California. And that's largely because of Mark Kukacek and the people at the San Diego Beekeeping Society, constituents discussing what they wanted from the county and having an input in their rules and regulations, and that's what I would like to have everybody encouraged to do. And hopefully this will give you some tips on where you want to go with that in your municipality. But this is pretty much where we were when we first started, before the ordinance was reformed. We had, yes, we're an AHB zone, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. We had distance from road was 100, and distance from buildings was 600, and you can go to the next one. So these have San Bernardino, San Diego, Santa Barbara, and you can see that there are hundreds of feet. And these rules were made many years ago, before it became so densely populated, so it didn't seem that important at the time. And the beekeepers were largely commercial, so the regulations suited them just fine. So the backyard hobbyist beekeepers wanted tightening up of the distance requirements so that they could have some in residential areas, and we worked with making with a lot of stakeholders on making our ordinance. So I just wanted to give you that. And I wanted to cover, because a lot of it's terminology, I'm throwing in terminology. This is from Mississippi, and I like Mississippi's regulations because they combine, it's a very apiculture intensive state, and they make things pretty simple and straightforward. So for honeybees, they have a definition. Colony, you can use colony or hive interchangeably, and for people who are not beekeepers, an individual box is basically where a colony resides. So or a hive, whatever you want to call it. So a stack of boxes, of white boxes, Langstroth hive is one colony. So then 2, 3, 4 colonies. That means that they're equipped with a queen, and so regardless, there are a number of things that we throw around for contagious items that affect honeybees. And what Jaime inspects for is foul brood, varroa mite, Africanized honeybee, chalk brood, or any other disease or parasite that might be suspicious that might affect the health of the hive. And generally speaking, the people who regulate are Bureau of Plant Industry, CDFA, Agricultural Commissioner, and the certificate of inspection is what I was just discussing before. It's an inspector that signs off on the health of your honeybees, saying to the next person down the line when they're moved, these bees, I certify that these are in good health. And you notice that the CDFA only allowed 7 days window, so those bees had to be inspected like readily. They're not just months away or whatever. And that speaks to how fast a disease can affect a colony. So here we go with the next one. Registered location. Every state requires registration, and if you're a city or a municipality, in San Diego County, you've got to realize that we keep the names of the beekeepers. So if you want to know beekeepers in your city, you might want to have them sign in with you separately, because like I said before, we have privacy rules. what we can do is give the beekeeper a little note that says we're registered, and then they can give to the zoning compliance officer a note from Jaime that says we're registered. So like the city of San Diego requires that you're registered with the Department of Agriculture, the Agricultural Commissioner's Office. You wouldn't know that when as a zone enforcement officer, you wouldn't know that when you come upon bees in the city of San Diego. You would have to ask the beekeeper, are you registered, and show me the proof. And they would give you a printout from Jaime that says you're registered. So that some different cities require you to sign in, and some don't. Now quarantined, sorry Leah, quarantined, for those of you who are not used to the idea of quarantine, is that when we find a pest in plants and fruit, some economically important pest, it's just like if you were a person with a disease. They're isolated. In the case of honeybees, we either call it depopulated, destroyed, abated, exterminated, whatever word you want to use. The infested, contaminated honeybee insects that are have the disease are destroyed, or they don't die already by themselves. But usually, because diseases have a way of being transferred very easily from honeybee to honeybee or insect to insect, they need to be destroyed and contained, and then the bees in the area will all go on hold, and they will be watched for health signs if they have the disease. So there's a certain, always like an epicenter, and then an area around that epicenter where it has to be contained and controlled. And then if those show up with the disease, then they would be destroyed. So that is how the quarantine works. Okay? Now, for those of you, again, I'm going to go quick through these bees, but everyone I talk to about insects, I always repeat, egg, larva, pupa, adult. Egg, larva, pupa, adult. The insects that go through full metamorphosis go through these stages. And with honeybees, I just want to say the European bees, which I'll discuss, Africanized bees, are shorter lifespan. They require less time to develop, which gives them a huge reproductive advantage. Okay? Oh, I forgot to say there's a queen cell. This is a little thing, if anybody has heard of royal honey or royal jelly, or not royal honey, royal jelly, it's what the workers feed the queen to make her develop reproductive organs. And it's in this little capsule here for the little larva to feed on. And this is a queen cell. A queen will develop, they look like little peanuts. The hive will make the queen in order, when their existing queen is not up to snuff, so to speak. Okay, now this is the other thing, okay? So you all know the hexagonal cage, little things that honeybees make when you look at them. And they are, so the honeybee lays an egg in that little container where the larva develops for the rest of its life. So the honeybee queen lays an egg. The little larva, for pictorial explanation, they show the different stages in different cells, but all this happens in one cell. The egg is laid, the larva develops in that cell as they're being fed, and then when they get to a certain point where they don't need to eat anymore and they go into the pupal stage where they go into metamorphosis, they get capped over. Then they go through full metamorphosis and then emerge as an adult. Now, a lot of, just for your information, this capping sequence could be important in the control of this bad varroa mite that everybody talks about. A varroa mite is the disease that, or the, I'd call it a parasite that plagues honeybees, and it mostly attacks this stage where it's unable to defend itself. And so they take full advantage of sucking the juices off of these bees. And so that's a huge issue. If you hear about varroa mite, it's probably the biggest issue besides nutrition in honeybee care today. So, and just for your information, this is the really neat thing about honeybees. As they go through their life, they change their role in the hive. When they're young, they start off doing internal duties of caretaking, and then as they age, they get sent on more and riskier missions. So what you get is patrolling and foraging. Foraging in particular, you can see as they're younger, they stay in the hive and clean cells and do all the tending to the inside the hive. And as they get outside, as they grow older and they're less, they're less of value to the hive, they go out on riskier and riskier missions. And so when people call us and say, I saw a dead bee, I'm having a panic attack, we say, don't worry about it, she was doing her job and you know, died on the pavement, right. So they do have to die, they don't live forever, okay? And then the other cool thing about bees is as the season goes by, they take advantage of all different plants that as they're flowering. So you see all these different plants that they've fed on to keep the hive alive and collect honey. And most beekeepers are excellent botanists. They know exactly what plants are what at this time. So they know what their bees are feeding on. So as I said before, they change their duties as they go, but it's the workers that do the work. Those are the ones that change from tending inside the nest to foraging. And they are females. They're basically clones of the mother. And when the female decides, when the pheromones in the hive change to signal the weakening of the queen, the female starts putting out drones, and they start making a queen cell for the next generation. So the drones are fertilized. Wait, the drones? I'm getting confused now. Queen.
Female. Unfertilized workers lay drone eggs.
Okay, there you go. Yep. I'm getting them mixed up.
Fertilize eggs and they become drones.
There you go. Okay, I'm glad you're here. Okay, keep going. Okay, so there's the travel distance of honeybees. This is a general, I don't know if you can see this. I switched this from meters to miles. And you can see a good group of honeybees tend to go out a half a mile. And then they can go out to 5.5 miles. So this is, generally speaking, when you hear people say, honeybees can go out 5 miles to collect what they need for their hive. So they're now thinking that bees evolved in Asia and then split to Europe and split to Africa. And I like to think of this as the bees that like winter and the bees that like summer. In Africa, they tend to be more migratory, evolved for a desert. In the north, they tend to prepare for winter and store honey and go into sort of able to go into a state where they can withstand the winter. And this was the group that, you can go to the next one. This group in Europe is where a lot of the honeybees that are domesticated honeybees originate from. And so you'll talk with beekeepers and they'll say, I've got a Carnica bee, I've got a linguista, I've got, you know, different strains from different parts of Europe that where they were domesticated, and individual beekeepers developed these strains over a 1,000 years or so. And so this says the same thing, that European bees and African bees are cultivated in each place, but the European honeybee is the one that has been distributed throughout the world as the creature to be domesticated and pollinate and do honey production. And this European honeybee was imported to the United States. Go ahead. Now, the African honeybee was imported to Brazil in '56 and then migrated. Because it has such a reproductive advantage, it migrated and moved north. It also has a habit of migration. Okay, next. It also makes smaller swarms, swarms more frequently, swarms more often. It's not a stayed bee. It is evolved for migration and desert conditions and traveling further distances, and it's not able to survive in cold temperatures. Okay? And so here in Southern California, a lot of these Africanized honeybees, when they're ready to, when they get up to a certain size, they'll move on and spawn a new swarm. So swarms are when the honeybee decides that they've taken up the space in their current cavity and they want to move on, or genetically with Africanized honeybees, they tend to swarm more often. They will go to a tree branch or another place where they can find a new nesting site. And with Africanized bees, I think Jaime's decided that they tend to be lower in the profile, and as opposed to up in trees, but they love little small objects in people's backyards. So that's why I always tell people, before you take out your mower, your chainsaw, and other things when you're working in your yard, listen. Listen for a humming sound, and before you go out there and do work in your yard, and make sure you don't have an Africanized honeybee out there. Yes?
So these swarms that are in the people's backyards, what's the county's responsibility or the city's responsibility for monitoring them or eradication or?
I think we're going to cover that, and we're going to cover that in detail. But basically, if it's private property, it's your own business, especially with swarms. With swarms. So it's like a bird. It's like a bird nest. It's something that settles.
It's a swarm that got established over, it's been there 6 months.
Then it's not a swarm anymore.
Right.
So that would be a nest, and that's still private property owner responsibility. Yep. So when it's on county property or city property, then and it's in a place where it might cause public safety issues, then the county and the city usually go out and remove it. So, and that's a question that we get a lot from the public. What can you do to help me with my bee? And we refer them to the Bee Society or a pest control company, depending on the circumstances of, you know, the location of the hive. We usually never want them to engage in, you know, yeah. Okay. So this is the public safety part. So Africanized bees, 80% of our bees that are feral have mitochondrial DNA that is Africanized, shows African DNA, and so they have enhanced defensive behavior. They get agitated more easily, and tied or enclosed pests are the most common victims. Okay, so there we go. That's your spiel on Africanized honeybees, that we have them. That's an issue for us safety-wise. Yes?
Another question. So how do you, what's the current identification of an Africanized bee? Is it, visual or behavioral, or is it DNA?
The DNA is not far enough along to make that easy for us. So that's a whole area, but basically we judge it based on defensiveness. So whether, for public safety purposes, whether it's European or Africanized, we really don't care about the genetics as much as we care about the behavior. So if Jaime goes out and he gets out of his car and they hit him, you're in bad luck, right? Yes?
Prior to the arrival, my father and I kept these, and we always had swarms that were very aggressive. So there's a...
Yes, European honeybees can also kill people and pets. There's no question about it. So, okay, so here we are. Any other questions? Yes?
I have just a general question on the county best practices or regulations regarding Africanized setting I do free bee removal folks. And we occasionally come across Africanized, what we would consider Africanized bees. Although, given, some non-Africanized colonies, they can also be aggressive if they don't have queens or if it's in a sudden dearth. But we occasionally come across very aggressive bees that we realize are Africanized. What are there any county recommendations or codes regarding how to dispose of those and how to do that humanely? We have our own practices on how to do that humanely if we need to, but are there any laws on the books or recommendations?
No, there's no real laws on the books regarding, you are not certified. I know that you're not certified to use pesticides, correct?
Right.
Okay, so if you were a certified pesticide applicator, you could legally use insecticides to kill bees.
Well, we would never do that.
Okay.
We typically use
You-
YIs or other
Yeah,
non...
you can use, we don't have any recommendations because we leave it up to you how you want to do it. You can use CO2 is the most humane, which is apparently what you're using. But depending on the circumstance, you can, there's a few options, but we don't specify.
No, nor
No.
do we, no.
Okay, so let's take a look at, so what I wanted to say is that there's a difference between what's in the laws and what are the regulations. So the laws are like the statutes that are on the books, and regulations are the guidebook for how to interpret the laws. And this is from Mississippi, and I just want to point out a few things that are common among bee regulations. And a little bit about Mississippi's. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Laws or statutes, regulations are policies and procedures to carry out the laws. And there's a terminology called compliance agreements. And these are agreements that are not statutes, but they're agreements that the honeybee keeper and the agency regulating bees sign and agree to on the methods of beekeeping. And so if you look at San Diego's regulations, it says beekeeper agrees to sign compliance agreement regarding honeybees. And the benefit to compliance agreements that Florida and many places have them, and they allow you to adapt to changing circumstances. So the laws are on the books, but the compliance agreement, if there was actually some kind of contagion in San Diego County, we would go out to every beekeeper and say, you need to sign this compliance agreement that you're going to do X, Y, and Z, because we need to get this thing under control. And we would hunt you down and have, tell you, explain what the best management practices were, and have you do what we would like you to do to contain the contagion. So the permits we discussed, they're either pre or post, or, depending on the state. They're inspections saying it's healthy, and then the inspector is the person that has authority to take regulatory action. Okay, and so that's the terminology for just to make sure we're all on the same base. Most honeybee regulations have something in hand for bees that are being neglected. Bees that are abandoned, bees that haven't had anybody look at them, collapsing hives, because they are a nuisance. They're a nuisance for many different reasons. They're a nuisance because they're not being cared for. They could be hungry and angry. They could be a source of infestation. They could be a bunch of vectors for a lot of different diseases if they're not being treated, managed. So most places have that. Some states have compliance agreements, as I discussed, and San Diego County does, and permits again. So everybody's up to date on those terms, okay? And Mississippi statute, when you bring bees into the state, you've got to have a certificate. And I'm sure that if you don't have a certificate, they would probably inspect you to make sure that you were, complying with the idea. Yeah.
So if I have a hive in Florida and I'm bringing it to California and I'm going through Mississippi, do I have to get a permit for Mississippi, Alabama, everybody?
All the way across?
Probably.
So I'm going to need like 8 permits.
Yes.
Well, this is where those interstate agreements apply. So Mississippi will probably has a list of states that they have agreed to accept their permits, okay? But, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because there's a subtle point in that. If Mississippi finds that that a bunch of Florida shipments are not meeting the standard, okay? Normally an inspector goes, okay, Florida certified it, check, you go, okay? But if that inspector goes ahead and says, oh, this shipment from Florida, it just smells bad, I'm opening it up, right? So they open it up and they say, what the heck, this is certified, and they certified this thing? So what will happen is the officials in Mississippi will talk to Florida and go, you just sent me a bunch of hives that have contamination. I'm rescinding our agreement. You better straighten up your act, or I'm not going to let those bees come into Mississippi. And so this is the argument that goes along between states about shipments. If you have an inspector sign and say, I certify this is clean, it better be clean, because there'll be arguments back and forth between the officials. And they'll maybe let one slide or something like that, but once if it starts being a pattern, they will change their regulations. Yes?
How does that work out for online stuff, ordered mail, UPS, queens?
Well, so what happens is, if it's a queen breeder, they're like in Florida, there's a lot of queen breeders, or they are certified by an inspector that their apiary is clean, and they get a permit for a certain number of months where they put that on a box. They get a little tag that says this queen breeder has been certified clean and free from pests and diseases, and they stick that on the box. And when it gets dropped in the mail, if one of our detector dogs finds a queen bee in the mail, because they sniff out plant material and things like that. Yeah, we have 2 detector dogs that do the UPS and FedEx for plant products. So if they happen to run against a bee in there, the inspector looks at it and goes, oh, this has got the certification. It goes down the line. So that's how that works, is that San Diego doesn't have any queen breeders that ship out that are certified. So we used to have one that did artificial insemination because he needed to do that because he didn't allow free mating with the Africanized honeybees. Most honeybee breeders allow free mating because they're not in an Africanized honeybee area. But we had to certify that his colonies were clean and that he was doing artificial insemination. Yes?
Does the San Diego County, or if the state, are they looking at introducing any technologies for tracking these transactions, what's known as custody chain technologies?
Well,
between
I'm going to
different
talk
parties?
about that a little bit.
Okay.
No, not
No?
right now,
Okay.
but it's definitely something in the future. Okay, so here, almost every single apiary law has freedom from pests statutes, okay? Then almost every apiary law has the ability to make inspections and come into, go into properties with apiaries. Doesn't mean they can go through your house, but they can make access if they feel there's reasonable cause that this has diseases. And in Mississippi, for example, they specify, and we don't specify if you have varroa mite, you need to do X, Y, and Z. But they even go as far to specify the remedy that you do when you have varroa mite or when you have tracheal mite or when you have, we don't get into such detail. Okay, Leah? And then the almost all have some type of guidelines for quarantine and abatement. If there was a quarantine, if we needed to abate. So those are very common among almost all apiary regulations, okay? And if there's almost always violations and it's almost always misdemeanors and added up, and different states weigh different activities as having greater or less violations. So in California, for you to transport honeybees during the day without a cage on them, it's pretty taken very seriously. So there's different weights on different items depending on what state you're in. And as I said before, the compliance agreements add flexibility in response to changing conditions. And so, for example, technology improves and we can go out and do a ELISA test on a honeybee, mush it into like a pregnancy test and take a sample of the hemolymph and test it for Africanization. We're going to add that to our compliance agreement so that when Jaime goes out to a honeybee colony, he can take that honeybee and know right then what the genetics are. Okay, so it can change, whatever. The compliance agreement will say, allow inspector to take one sample of one honeybee from your colony, or something like that. I mean, so we can change it based on conditions, even though the laws stay the same. Okay. Leah, next one. I am going to let you know that basically this compliance agreement from Alabama is very similar to Florida, which you have a copy of in your packet. And it explains all sorts of things about trying to keep your colonies free from Africanized honeybees. And it discusses, how many drones keeping drone brood and, not collecting swarms in your area and making colonies out of swarms. And basically all sorts of good things that are related to honeybee health, but also result in public safety. So my motion to you is that if you take good care of your honeybees, there really shouldn't be safety issues, public safety issues. And so this doesn't specifically, next one, The only thing that this specifically addresses here is that to protect public safety and reduce beekeeping liability, do not site apiaries in proximity to tethered or confined animals. Students, elderly, general public interactives with these groups may have higher likelihood of occurring. So it's giving you a general guideline. It's not saying how much distance there is between your bees and the property line or anything like that. It's much more general. But it's giving the beekeeper guidelines so that his honeybees don't become Africanized. And it's saying, don't get in a tangle with the public over your honeybees and treat them with respect. That's what it is. And so they're just giving general guidelines, okay? Yes?
Is that similar to the guidelines in San Diego?
Ours are much more specific. Okay, so then when the San Diego Beekeeping Society came to me and the county and said, you know, we need to change our ordinance, I went and looked all around, and Leah helped, and everybody was involved. And Florida really stands out to me as a shining example of where we took the basis of what we did. And the reason why Florida is great is because there's great cooperation between the university and the regulators. So when the regulations were made in cooperation with the university, and the university supports the regulators. So when there's a regulation that is written in regulatory language, which nobody likes to read, that's difficult to understand, the university comes in and explains, okay, why are you doing these best management practices? So Florida was what we modeled our statute off of, and it has this is the law, and these are the best management practices written up by Florida University, and that's what we're trying to do here with we're trying to do this here with the University of California and the regulatory bodies, okay, so that the university is giving you the technical information you need. And you can see Florida, these are all the honeybees in Florida.
Wow.
Okay, and you can look at this, but you will see a lot of commonalities in what Florida requires compared to what we require. Okay, next one. And the compliance agreement, this is specific best management practices for managing honeybee colonies, but they have best management practices for queen rearing. They have best management practices for all different things you might want to do with bees. Okay? And for people in San Diego, the municipalities, when you're going to write legislation, you need to have it based on input from stakeholders. We had a ton of different people we sent out an EIR. We had tons of people comment on what our beekeeping ordinance was going to be. And it's going to depend on the financial status of the municipality. San Diego County was, the Board of Supervisors endorsed this. They're pro-beekeeping. They wanted to have pay for an inspector. They wanted to have a full-on beekeeping group here. So they were on board with this because some of them had been beekeepers in the past. But there's flexibility. The emphasis can be based on your environment. They can emphasize, as we said, I covered in there the rules and regulations from Mississippi, which emphasizes honeybee safety. But in the city of San Diego, you might want to emphasize more public safety, and some combination of the two. It has to be complementary to other regulations. When we did our looking of what was on the books, zoning had already something in, the county had 2 things on the books about bees. One was in zoning, and it had it under animal law, and we had our whole ordinance over here in agriculture. And so one of the things we did when we tweaked the rules was to get rid of the zoning part so that people aren't confused about what their rules they should follow. And the mechanism to gain voluntary participation, because nobody wants to use enforcement, but you also have to have tools in case there's a non-compliance issue. Okay? There you go. And these are some variables to consider. If you want to have beekeeper contact information, if you want to have them report into City Hall, do you want to give permits? Do you want to have them give, I think Leah will talk a little bit about that. Which agency? Some cities have animal control going out and inspecting. Some people have planning. You know, we have agriculture, that, you know, but depending, that's because we work closely with the CDFA, so it's normal for us to have it under agriculture. Do you want to have fees? Our fees are just $10 for anyone with more than 10 hives, but some cities might want to have fees. Enforcement options, new or existing. You don't need to rewrite the book. There's already enforcement protocols for zoning and other things on most city municipalities' docket. So you could just use what you already have and refer to those, okay? And what might make beekeeping work in your municipality? These are just some thoughts that I have. Defining the limit on the number of hives, because, you know, if it gets too much, then you're going to run into trouble if the bees are hangry. Certain distances. Distance is your friend. If the beehive becomes Africanized, distance is your friend, because they will be patrolling a certain area, and that gives people time to react. So you don't want to have things too in close proximity in case a hive becomes Africanized, but that's up to you guys. Sensitive sites, this was something that Florida has and we copied, but also it was really endorsed by our planning groups. They wanted to have sensitive sites in case there was an allergic person, a disabled person, children, etc. A method for addressing complaints and conflicts. Flyover barriers is a technique to send the bees up and over a structure so that they do not head along a path that is on level with people walking in the street. And then you want to have urgency to over-defensive and stinging incidents. We would really like to see the cities in San Diego County have some amount of urgency when there's a stinging complaint. Our personal goal, Jaime and my goal, is to respond within 24 hours if there's a stinging or over-defensive hive. Unfortunately, we find out too late sometimes. And then there might be some best management practices that I didn't show you today that you can think of that might be new and different, like applying technology, as Simon said. And this is like I said, our Board of Supervisors supports our program. The CDFA is getting more supportive of our program. We have infrastructure that makes our program work, which is inspectors and staff. We have a bee hotline that we established in like 1999 for when Africanized bees first came to San Diego. They set up a hotline because we didn't know what the impact was going to be. And there was a big outreach effort at the time and monitoring, and until they became fully established and kind of stopped migrating north, they monitored them, and they monitored the number of people that were stung and how many people got put in the hospital and all this other stuff that we don't do anymore. So we have educational support by UC Cooperative Extension, registration, we have BMPs in sensitive sites again, and we're growing to address other issues. So we want to be a resource for you guys when you're going ahead and making your decisions about what sort of legislation you want to have in your municipality. And the basic thing here is that well cared for bees are well behaved bees. That's basically what we found out in our past 2 years of having this program. Okay, Leah? And my suggestions are that you should be proactive to assume that issues will change. When you make these rules and regulations, one of the deficiencies was that a lot of the rules federally and statewide had to do with a specific disease, foul brood. It sort of applies to other diseases, but it's not written as open as it could be, so that the next thing is going to be the worst thing, right? The next thing that you don't know is coming, the next contagion is going to be your worst nightmare. So you want to be prepared for this, and you want to allow flexibility to employ future technologies. So you don't want to be limited. Like a lot of the Florida stuff says, we want to test your bees for Africanization using size measurement. Well, size measurement, you know, that went by the wayside when there was a lot of hybridization. So it's, you know, it's a lot of wasted verbiage that nobody uses anymore. And, well, I shouldn't say that nobody uses it anymore. People do still use it, but it's not looking forward to what technologies might be useful in the future. You want to have input from your stakeholders that doesn't, and make your rules so that it does not represent a risk to apiculture, the apicultural industry. Yes, everybody's opinion needs to be included, but you need to be mindful of what I showed you before, that there's a lot hinging on contagion. If contagion starts, that you need to be mindful that this has a big impact in agriculture. And so it's great to have input from everybody, but you want to be cognizant of what that impact might have. And what I was saying before about syncing with other regulatory agencies, whatever you set up, make sure it doesn't conflict with another regulatory agency. And always put in a sunset clause or something that makes you review the regulation every decade or something to make sure that it's, you know, still relevant. Because we're looking at stuff that's been written in 1940 and it really is not as fresh as we would like it to be. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. And thank you very much.